It's pushing 85 degrees outside right now. The air is so thick it feels like you're walking through a damp wool blanket. But honestly, I'm sitting right here on the porch, and I'm actually shivering a little bit. I had to go inside and put this flannel shirt on just to stay comfortable. If the summer heat has you completely exhausted, but the thought of turning on your central air and getting that utility bill next month makes your chest tight, I want to show you something. I'm going to show you how to turn just a regular cheap standing fan into a whole room air conditioner. All you need are 2 frozen plastic bottles and a couple of zip ties. It costs absolutely $0. No hardware store runs, no special tools, no messing with electricity. I actually tried to set this up and show you guys 2 days ago when it hit 95 degrees, but the humidity kept fogging up the camera lens. Then I dropped one of the ice bottles on my foot and it started raining anyway, so I just gave up for the afternoon. Sometimes you just have to let the weather win. I'm John. A few years ago, if you told me I'd be sitting on a wooden deck in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, figuring out how to cool a room with ice, I probably would have thought you were crazy. Back then, I was living in a 3rd-floor apartment in the city. The building was solid brick. In July and August, those bricks would soak up the sun all day long. By 8 o'clock at night, you could literally place your bare palm flat against the living room wall and feel the heat radiating into the room. It was like living inside a masonry oven. I had this big clunky window AC unit. I paid way too much for it at a big box store. The plastic louvers on the front were always stuck pointing slightly downward, blowing freezing air directly onto my knees while the rest of the room stayed suffocatingly hot. It rattled. Oh, it rattled so loudly against the window frame that I had to wedge folded pieces of cardboard underneath it, which only sort of worked. I'd come home from the office, my shirt sticking to my back, and turn that thing on. It always smelled a little bit like old dust and ozone. I'd sit on the edge of my mattress, staring at the wall, listening to the compressor groan. I remember the tap water always tasted faintly of copper during those months. I wouldn't even turn on the television because I felt like the screen gave off too much heat. And the worst part? I was paying over $200 a month for that privilege, just writing a check to the utility company every 4 weeks so I could sit in a noisy, vibrating room and still sweat. We get so used to that cycle. The appliance companies build these incredibly complex machines filled with chemical refrigerants and delicate computer boards. They design them so you can't fix them yourself. When my unit finally gave out, it just sputtered and died right in the middle of a brutal heat wave. I unscrewed the front panel and just stared at the copper coils. I didn't know what I was looking at. I called a repair service, and they told me it would be a 3-week wait and a $150 diagnostic fee just for a guy to drive to my building and tell me it was broken. I ended up sleeping on the metal fire escape that night. It was loud. There were sirens echoing down the avenue, but it was the only place I could catch a stray breeze. I realized then how entirely dependent I had become. If I couldn't plug something into a wall, I didn't know how to make myself comfortable. Moving out here and spending time with Elias Yoder and his family completely shifted my perspective. The Amish don't have central air conditioning. There are no humming metal boxes sitting outside their farmhouse windows. When I first got here during the summer, I was dreading the heat. I thought I'd be spending my afternoons laying flat on the kitchen floor tiles just to survive. But one afternoon, it was hovering around 90 degrees and I walked into the Yoder's kitchen. The air inside was completely different. It was heavy, sure, but it was cool. It smelled like fresh cut hay and damp earth. Elias was standing by the large open window at the back of the house. He didn't say anything at first. He just pointed to a large galvanized metal basin sitting on the long oak dining table. Inside the basin was a massive block of ice. They had brought it up from the ice house earlier that morning. He had positioned the basin perfectly in the cross breeze coming from the west window and flowing out toward the hallway. I stood there, and I could physically feel the temperature of the air dropping as it moved over that melting ice and hit my face. It was so quiet. Just the distant sound of a horse and buggy out on the gravel road, and the slow, rhythmic dripping of water hitting the tin side of the basin. No rattling compressors, no electric meters spinning out of control, just a profound, quiet understanding of how the world works. It made me think about my grandparents. They used to live in a drafty old house with high ceilings and transom windows. They knew how to manage airflow. They knew how to close the heavy curtains on the south side of the house in the morning and open the north-facing windows at dusk. Somewhere along the line, we traded all that generational knowledge for a plastic remote control and a monthly subscription to the power grid. I stood in that kitchen for a long time, watching the small pool of water form around the base of the ice block. It's strange how a piece of frozen water in a tin bucket can make you question every expensive thing you ever bought to make your life easier. I actually tried dragging a metal bucket of ice into my own bedroom here the very next day. I set it on top of a folded towel on my dresser, hoping it would work the same magic. But the air in my room was completely stagnant. The farmhouse has those big windows perfectly aligned to catch the valley breeze, but my room is tucked away in the back corner. The ice just sat there, sweating and melting into a lukewarm puddle while I sat on the edge of the bed, still sweating right along with it. I realized I needed to force the air to move. I had this plain gray Lasco standing fan I bought at a pharmacy a couple of years ago. I was looking at it, wiping this weird, greasy layer of gray dust off the plastic grill. Have you ever noticed how fan blades always collect that sticky dust no matter how clean your house is? I don't know what that is. Anyway, looking at the motor housing, it hit me. We buy all these expensive internet-connected smart fans now. They put a microchip in a plastic base, connect it to your Wi-Fi, and suddenly a basic motor and some plastic blades cost almost $300. And they do that because you can't fix a microchip with a Phillips head screwdriver when it inevitably burns out right after the warranty expires. They don't want you fixing things. They want you replacing things. So I decided to just use the cheap fan and the ice. The first time I tried to combine them, I got the physics completely backward. I actually stacked a few frozen water bottles on a stool directly in front of the fan, thinking the wind would hit the plastic and push cold air toward me. All it did was blow room temperature air against the bottles, warming them up faster, and occasionally knocking one over onto my rug. The water soaked right through to the floorboards. I had to use 3 towels to sop it up. It took me a frankly embarrassing amount of time to remember how a fan actually works. It doesn't just create wind out of nowhere. It pulls air from behind it and pushes it forward. If you want to cool the air, you have to intercept it before it hits the blades. It's just basic heat exchange. Thermodynamics. When the warm air from the room is pulled across a freezing surface, the heat energy in the air transfers into the ice. The air loses its heat, and what gets pushed out the front of the fan is significantly cooler. But there was another problem. I just filled 2 empty 1-liter soda bottles with tap water and froze them. I strapped them to the back of the fan, turned it on, and it felt amazing. The temperature in the room dropped almost instantly. But plain water melts fast. Within maybe 90 minutes, the bottles were just room temperature water. I didn't want to be running back and forth to the kitchen freezer every hour and a half. I was watching Elias's wife, Sarah, making hand-cranked ice cream a few weeks later. She was packing the wooden barrel with crushed ice, but she kept pouring heavy scoops of coarse rock salt over the ice. I asked her why she was ruining perfectly good ice with salt. She just laughed and said the salt makes the cold stick around longer. She's absolutely right, and there is actual science behind it. When you add salt to water, it lowers the freezing point. Plain water freezes at 32 degrees Fahrenheit, but salt water has to get much colder than that to turn solid. So when it finally does freeze in your kitchen freezer, that block of salted ice is actually significantly colder than a block of pure ice. Because it starts out at a much lower temperature, it takes a lot longer for the ambient heat in the room to melt it back down to a liquid. You just need to take your 2 empty 1-liter bottles. I like the skinny ones because they fit the back of the fan better. Fill them up with water from the tap, but leave a couple of inches of empty space at the top because the ice needs room to expand. Then you want to pour about a 1/4 cup of regular, cheap table salt into each bottle. Just regular iodized salt, the kind that comes in the blue cardboard cylinder. Put the cap on and shake it up really well until the salt dissolves. I will warn you, do not put more than 1/3 of a cup of salt in there. I figured if a little salt was good, a lot of salt would be better, right? I dumped almost half a cup into one bottle. I left it in the freezer overnight. When I pulled it out the next morning, it wasn't solid. It was this thick, heavy, super chilled liquid slush. It felt like walking on wet, heavy snow when it's starting to melt in March. Most residential freezers simply don't get cold enough to freeze water with that much salt content, so stick to a 1/4 cup. It is strange holding a bottle of frozen salt water. The plastic gets rigid, almost brittle feeling, and the frost on the outside instantly sticks to your warm fingers. It makes you realize how much potential energy we just ignore every day, hiding in basic kitchen ingredients while we wait for some corporation to sell us a complicated solution in a cardboard box. When those bottles finally freeze, mine took about 5 hours, but I usually just leave them in the icebox overnight. You pull them out, and they feel like solid bricks of glass. The plastic makes this sharp, almost brittle cracking sound when the humid room air hits it. A layer of white frost instantly blooms over the outside of the clear bottle, and within seconds, it melts into heavy condensation against the warmth of your hands. It's a heavy, satisfying weight. I brought the bottles back into the bedroom, holding them away from my shirt so they wouldn't drip all over me. You want to make sure your fan is entirely unplugged from the wall socket before you start messing around with the back of it. I actually shocked my thumb once a few years back, trying to wipe a thick layer of dust off a plugged-in fan with a damp washcloth. The sting traveled all the way up through my wrist to my elbow, leaving my arm numb. It wasn't my smartest moment, and I stood there in my old living room, just shaking my hand out for a good 5 minutes, feeling like an absolute idiot. So, pull the plug. You are going to mount these frozen bottles on the back of the fan cage. Now you have to attach them upside down. I didn't realize this at first. I tried mounting them right side up, balancing them on the lower curve of the plastic motor housing, but the heavy base of the bottle just made it slide straight down through the plastic ties. It crashed right onto the base of the fan, bouncing off and rolling under the bed. I had to get down on my hands and knees to fish it out from the dust bunnies. The skinny neck needs to point toward the floor, with the thick base resting near the top of the cage. It creates a wedge shape that naturally holds against the fasteners as the ice melts and the water shifts inside. I'm using basic nylon zip ties to hold them in place. I know I have a whole rusted coffee can full of black zip ties somewhere out in Elias's tool shed, but it was raining slightly, and I didn't want to walk through the mud. I could only find these bright white ones in the kitchen junk drawer. They work just fine, even if they look a little stark against the dark gray plastic of the fan. It's incredibly awkward trying to do this by yourself. The bottle is freezing cold, your fingers get wet and slippery from the condensation, and the plastic zip tie keeps bending the wrong way when you try to push it through the metal grating. I was fumbling with it for what felt like forever, pressing my chin against the top of the bottle to hold it flat against the metal grill, while trying to blindly thread the little plastic tab through the square hole. Elias's youngest son was walking down the hallway, carrying a heavy woven basket of laundry. He just stopped in the doorway, watched me wrestle with this wet plastic bottle and a zip tie for about 30 seconds, let out a quiet little sigh, and kept walking without saying a single word. I felt pretty ridiculous. I probably should have just swallowed my pride and asked for an extra set of hands. You need 2 zip ties for each bottle, one secured tightly around the narrow neck at the bottom, and another one holding the wider middle section near the top. You really have to pull them hard. You want to listen for that sharp little clicking, zipping sound as the plastic teeth lock in. And here is a very important detail. Make sure the bottles aren't pressing inward against the actual fan blades. I had the left bottle leaning slightly too far in. When I plugged the fan back in and tested it, the spinning plastic blade hit the side of the bottle and made this horrific rapid-fire slapping noise, like a motorcycle engine backfiring in my bedroom. I scrambled to pull the plug out of the wall, completely convinced I had just shattered the blades or burned out the cheap little motor. I ended up having to clip the zip tie off with a pair of fingernail clippers because I couldn't find my scissors, and then remount the whole thing a quarter of an inch further outward. Before you hit the power button for real, go to the linen closet and grab a thick folded bath towel. Lay it completely flat on the floorboards, directly beneath the back motor housing of the fan. As that super chilled saltwater ice absorbs the ambient heat from your stifling room, the outside of the plastic is going to sweat profusely. It drips continuously, running down the grooves of the plastic bottle and falling off the cap. If you forget the towel, you're going to end up with a warped hardwood floor or a soaked patch of carpet that will smell faintly like mildew for the next 3 years. Once the towel is down and the bottles are secure, you plug it in. I reached down, hit the button for the second speed setting, and pulled the little knob on top to make the fan oscillate. It isn't an instant miracle. For the first minute or two, it just feels like the exact same hot, heavy room air blowing against your face. I sat down heavily in the armchair across the room, wiping the cold condensation off my palms onto my jeans. I was staring at this absurd makeshift contraption. 2 soda bottles, strapped to a cheap pharmacy fan, dripping onto a faded brown towel. I honestly felt a sudden, heavy wave of foolishness. I thought about the sleek, silent central air systems in the city office buildings I used to work in, and the exorbitant amount of money I used to make just a few years ago. And here I was, sitting in a farmhouse bedroom, tying garbage to a broken appliance, waiting for the wind to change. But then, maybe 3 or 4 minutes in, the fan swept back toward me on its oscillation path, and the air hitting my face, it wasn't heavy anymore. It had this distinct, sharp crispness to it. It actually smelled different, too. It smelled a little bit like the inside of an old chest freezer down in a basement, just that very dry, stark cold. I sat up a little straighter. I watched the small analog thermometer I keep sitting over on the wooden bookshelf. The thin red line was hovering right around 85 degrees when I first plugged the fan in. After about 15 minutes, I walked over and tapped the glass dial with my fingernail just to make sure it wasn't stuck. It had dropped down to 75. By the time I had been sitting in that chair for half an hour, just listening to the rhythmic, sweeping hum of the plastic motor and the occasional wet plop of a water drop hitting the terry cloth towel on the floor, the room was sitting at a perfectly comfortable 68 degrees. Because of that quarter cup of salt we mixed into the water, those bottles don't just melt and give up in an hour. They hold on. They fight the heat. They stay in that rigid, frozen state for a solid 3 to 5 hours before the ice inside even fully breaks down into liquid. And even then, that water is hovering right around 32 degrees inside the plastic. It just keeps cooling the air being pulled across the back of the fan for another 2 hours easily. You're getting a good 5 to 8 hours of genuine quiet relief from a couple of pieces of recycling. That is an entire night of unbroken sleep without waking up with the sheets glued to your legs. I leaned my head back against the fabric of the armchair. Outside the window, the sky was finally starting to bruise a dark, heavy purple with those rain clouds that had been threatening all afternoon. The wind picked up, rustling the thick green leaves on the oak tree out by the gravel driveway. I realized I was actually chilly. I had to reach down and pull the collar of my flannel shirt tighter around my neck. I just sat there for a long time, watching the fan sweep back and forth. It made a very faint, repetitive clicking sound at the far left edge of its rotation. I thought about my grandfather. He lived in the same drafty, clapboard house his entire life. He never owned an air conditioner, not once in his entire 84 years on this earth. When the brutal dog days of August rolled in, they didn't retreat behind sealed double-pane windows and crank up a digital thermostat. They just adapted. They opened the tall windows on the shaded side of the house early in the morning to trap the cool air. They sat out on the wraparound porch in the evening with glasses of watered-down iced tea, waiting for the evening breeze to kick up off the river. They possessed this quiet, everyday wisdom. They knew how to live within their environment, how to manipulate it gently instead of constantly paying corporations to wage a loud, expensive war against the weather. We have gotten so incredibly accustomed to just buying our way out of minor discomforts. We happily trade away our basic self-reliance for a plug-in appliance that is purposefully designed to break and end up in a municipal landfill in 5 years. We forget how capable we actually are. But sitting here in this quiet, dim room, shivering just a little bit while a cheap piece of plastic and 2 pieces of frozen garbage push 68-degree air across my face, it just makes you wonder how many other simple, quiet truths we have forgotten how to do for ourselves